Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar today. We've got quite a few speakers today, so we should get started very shortly. If you could let us know of any technical issues in the chat, that would be great and we can get that fixed ASAP. And likewise, any questions, if you could use the question function or chat function. Due to the number of speakers today, it'd be great if you could say who your question is for. And without further ado then, I shall hand over to Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, hello. This is Mike Young, Marine Monitoring Specialist with Natural England. I am just going to introduce a couple of the sites really that we're talking about today. Let's get started. So the east side of the East Anglia coast is a hotspot for the sandbanks. You can see from this little map that we have quite a few sandbanks in the region. With my nice little neat pen, I've circled Inner Dowsing Racebank and Haysborough, Hammond and Winterton, which I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about. And the outside of that is North Norfolk Sandbanks. And further north in that big yellow blob is Dogger. So we have the three sites in close proximity. Two of them cross the 12 nautical mile boundary line as Inner Dowsing and Haysborough, Hammond and Winterton. So these were recommended in 2009, designated in 2017. So in about 2015, Natural England, JNCC have their own monitoring programs. So we realized that we were going to need a whole raft of evidence for these sandbank sites. And we came together, aligned our monitoring priorities and agreed to work together on this one. So it's a fully collaborative survey between Natural England, JNCC, CFAS and the Environment Agency. And this was really to see the greatest cost efficiencies here and get the most robust data collection. Quite a complex survey design, so it took quite a lot of time in the planning, quite a few meetings. I think resulted in over 50 vessel days on site. So if I just go on to the individual sites. So the first one's the Inner Dowsing Racebank and Northridge SAC. So that's located off Lincolnshire coast. There are two principal sandbanks. Northridge and Racebank is effectively one convoluted source sandbank with Inner Dowsing inside of that. And you can see on the map there, we've got the sandbanks and the Annex 1 reef layer there. The two designated features are the sandbanks, slightly covered by seawater all time, and for reefs, the Subilaria spinulosa reef. So obviously sandbank sites predominantly composed of sand, mixed sediment and the more stable coarse sediments. The thing about these sandbanks are really they're quite sheltered. They're good examples of the sheltered sandbanks. And between the sand, the mixed sediment and the more stable coarse sediment, we've got the substantial areas of Subilaria spinulosa. It's quite ephemeral and found predominantly in the troughs between the sandbanks, but also actually on the more stable flanks. But it wasn't just the two features themselves we're really interested in. It's also a little bit about the provisioning. So what the wider ecology of the sandbank system. With the sandbanks are fantastic for the sand eels, which I was meant to have an animation thing here, but it's not working. So the sand eels then providing food for the porpoise and puffins and a whole load of other fish and bird species there. Going on to Haysborough, Hammond and Winterton, this lies northeast of the Norfolk coast. It's a complex mosaic of habitats there from 2 to 52 meters depth. You can see from the map there's a lot more convoluted sandbanks there, a lot more complicated currents in there, and that results in a widespread range of exposure conditions, which is again reflected in the habitats and the mosaic of species and habitats across the site. Again, designated features are the sandbanks and the subspin reefs, and I think Louise is going to go into more detail later. And again, it's an important nursery ground for the sand eels, the plaice, the dabs, and these are both commercial species and provisioning species for other species there. And I'll just go back a slide actually. And one of the things I want to say is that Natural England, outside of this particular talk, but Natural England is doing a fair bit of work looking at the modelling of the provisioning species and how they interact with, for example, seabird populations. I just want to do a couple of minutes on a bit of the survey history. So the sites are covered by the Marine Aggregate Levy Sustainability Fund environmental characterization, regional environmental characterizations. So in 2008, there was the Humber one, and that covers Inner Dowsing and part of the North Norfolk Sandbanks and Sutton Reefs. The year before that, we had the 2007, I should have done these in a different order, East Coast Regional Environmental Characterization Survey, and that covers about half of Haysborough, Hammond and Winterton. This actually illustration shows it's a little bit better. In 2013, CFAS were commissioned by Natural England and JNCC to undertake a benthic survey of the 2 inshore sandbank sites. So there's a bit of historical evidence that we built up for these sites. And this particular survey was really to acquire evidence to assess the condition of the Annex 1 features where possible, and hopefully to develop a baseline for the future long-term monitoring. It's very hard to know how much data you need to collect to actually reach that standard, but that was the intent when the 2013 survey was put out. And then we move on to the survey that we're going to talk about in more detail today. The intent was a more comprehensive survey, sort of an all-encompassing T0 initially. The historical data was all used in the planning process here. But what we wanted to look is going beyond the Annex 1 features, looking at the sandbank movements, migrations, looking at, yes, the designated habitats, in terms of the detailed local diversity and sort of wider distribution across the site. And we did want to look a little bit more at the wider ecological functioning side, food webs and various elements of the sort of the wider value, ecological value of the sandbank system. But some of the scope that we initially started off with back in the planning phase had to be reined in because just sheer cost and time. And as I previously mentioned, it was quite a long survey as it stands, but we did have to rein it in a little bit. I have rattled through this a little bit quicker, only on 7 minutes. So the detailed outputs and findings, I think that's the interesting bit, we're all here for the science, are going to be presented and discussed by Jackie in a few minutes. But if Louisa, if you're ready, a couple of minutes early, I can hand over to you for an introduction into North Norfolk Sandbanks and Sutton Reef.
Yeah, lovely, thanks, Mike. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my screen sharing there. So my name's Louisa Jones and I work in the Marine Ecosystems team at JNCC, where I am the site lead for North Norfolk Sandbanks and Sutton Reef Special Area of Conservation, which is a site I'll be taking you through today. So the most up-to-date information on the site is published on the Site Information Centre, and the address is on the screen there, where there's a short video that can be found summarising key information about the site. So North Norfolk Sandbanks and Sutton Reefs, located in the southern North Sea, extends from about 40 kilometres off the northeast coast of Norfolk out to approximately 110 kilometres offshore. It's over 3,000 kilometres squared in size, which is about 2/3 of the size of Norfolk. So here's the timeline of the site's designation, which started in 2004, 2005, and was then formally designated as a special area of conservation in 2017. So there's 2 Annex 1 habitats are protected within the site, similar to as Mike's just gone through for Inner Dowsing and Haysborough Hammond. They're the sandbanks slightly covered by seawater all the time, and Annex 1 reefs for Sabellaria spinulosa reef, which is responsible for part of the site's namesake of Sutton Reef. Sand is the dominant sediment type across the MPA, and the crests of the bank are over 80% sand, while the troughs and areas between the topographic banks there have a slightly wider range of sediment grades, typically comprising 70 to 80% sand. So Sabellaria spinulosa biogenic reef consists of thousands of fragile sand tubes that are made by Ross worms, which are polychaetes, that have consolidated together to create a solid structure that rises above the seabed. The reefs formed by Sabellaria spinulosa allow the settlement of other species not found in adjacent habitats, which leads to a diverse community of epifauna and infauna species. So first discovered in 2002, the Satin Reef covered an area of approximately 750 metres by 500 metres. And more recent surveys, have not been able to identify that previous extent of Sabellaria spinulosa reef. However, it has been recorded on recent surveys within other areas of the site. For example, the 2013 survey and more recently the 2016 survey, which Jackie will be taking us through in a moment. We are also aware of industry data that has identified Sabellaria spinulosa reef within the site. The changing extent of this feature within the site highlights its ephemeral and transitory nature. However, the evidence indicates that conditions within the site are suitable for reef formation. To address and reflect the uncertainty in extent and distribution of Sabellaria spinulosa reefs within the site, a 500-metre margin has been applied to point records to create this area to be managed as reef. While the areas inside the margins are not confirmed but potential feature, JNCC and Natural England advise a precautionary approach to their management, so to treat them as if they were confirmed feature to ensure that there's appropriate protection now and into the future. Annex 1 sandbanks, slightly covered by seawater all the time, occur where areas of sand form distinct elevated topographic features which are predominantly surrounded by deeper water and where the top of the sandbank is in less than 20 metres water depth. However, the sides of the sandbanks can extend into deeper waters of up to 60 metres while still being considered part of the feature. The sandbanks within North Norfolk are made up of subtidal coarse sediment, subtidal mixed sediments, and subtidal sand. And the banks support communities of invertebrates which are typical of sandy sediments in the southern North Sea, such as polychaete worms, isopods, crabs, and starfish. The crests and flanks inshore are highly mobile, and communities within that part of the site are likely to be more diverse in epifauna with fewer infauna. And in the deeper waters of the site between the banks and with the distance offshore, more stable sand habitats can be found along with coarser and mixed sediment. So the important thing for this site is that the whole site is designated and viewed as one integrated sandbank system and reflects our current advice that its extent covers the entirety of the site. So this physical delineation has been further validated by biological community analysis from the 2013 survey data and is also supported by the original site assessment document for the site. So North Norfolk Sandbanks is the most extensive example of the offshore linear ridge sandbank type in UK waters. And there's a series of 10 main sandbanks you can see on the screen, which are formed as a result of tidal processes. The changes in the hydrodynamic regimes tend to influence the species present. So the sandbank structures are maintained through offshore sediment transport, with each bank acting as a stepping stone and the development of new sandbanks between each bank. So sand waves are present, being best developed on the inner banks and the outer banks having small or no sand waves associated with them. The sandbanks are also subject to a range of current strengths, which are strongest on the banks closest to the shore, as you'd expect, and reducing offshore, making the outer banks the best example of open sea tidal sandbanks in UK waters. So the conservation advice will be reviewed and updated after the monitoring report has been published. But as it stands, the conservation objectives for North Norfolk Sandbanks and Satin Reef are to restore the Annex 1 sandbanks and Annex 1 reef features to favourable condition. So there's a whistle-stop tour of North Norfolk for you, and I'll just hand over to Jackie now to give us an overview of the 2016 monitoring survey, if you're ready, Jackie.
Thanks very much, Louisa. Yes, I'm ready.
Great.
Can you see the screen?
Coming through fine.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. So as Louisa said, I am going to talk you through the 2016 survey, the design, the results and the recommendations that came out of the report. This was a joint survey between Natural England, JNCC, EA and CFAS. So the primary aim of the survey was to explore and describe the attributes of the Annex 1 features within North Norfolk Sandbanks and Saturn Reef, Hazebraham and Winterton, and Inner Dowsing, Racebank and North Ridge to assist future assessment of feature condition. Our main aims were to describe the extent and distribution of the Annex 1 features, both Sandbanks and Sub-area Reef, describe the function of the Annex, structure and function of the Annex 1 Sandbanks, and describe the structure of the Annex 1 Sub-area Spinulosa Reef. A secondary aim of the survey was to present evidence of relating to MSFD descriptors of good environmental status, descriptor 2 non-indigenous species, and descriptor 10 marine litter. So survey design. A K-means analysis of environmental parameters, bathymetry, currents, distance from shore, and VMS data was used to determine ecologically distinct zones. I'm just going to forward on. So it's these four main environmental attributes to determine the position of the survey locations. So two intensive themes were developed: an intensive sampling, a subset of sandbanks or case study areas were undertaken at 6 banks, and a series of lower intensive sampling, a wider number of sandbanks were undertaken within the 3 sites. Within North Norfolk Sandbanks, Indefatigable Bank, which is the most offshore bank, and Lehman Bank, the most inshore, were selected for intensive survey. Both are deep banks in low energy environments with previous surveys undertaken. Lehman Bank coincides with the proposed fisheries management area, whilst Indefatigable Bank doesn't. So I've already said that they represent the eastern and western edges of the entire sandbank complex. Plus there was 11 wider characterising transects undertaken. Hazebraham and Winterton, the 2 sites again represent the eastern and western areas, or inshore and offshore areas within the SAC. Southwest Haysborough Tail is representative of higher energy and coincides with a proposed fisheries management area. Smith's Knoll has been previously sampled, is a relatively steep bank, and is subject to fishing pressure. Plus there were additional 10 wider characterising transects. In Inner Dowsing, Racebank and North Ridge, we have Inner Dowsing and North Ridge. They represent inshore and offshore sandbanks within the SAC. Both are shallow banks in low energy environments. North Ridge is a relatively wide bank, and Inner Dowsing is a relatively steep bank. North Ridge coincides with the proposed fisheries management area, and Inner Dowsing doesn't. Previous surveys have been undertaken at Inner Dowsing, and there was one additional wider characterising transect due to there being fewer sandbank features. So the survey design. So first of all, we ran a multi-beam echo sounder across the sandbanks for each of both the CSAs and the case study areas and the wider characterising transects. There were 5 multi-beam lines run across each of the characterising transects, and a 0.1 Hammond grab was deployed at 10 sampling locations for each of the topographical zones. So we had the crest, the flank, and the trough. So why did we choose 10? Well, we undertook a power analysis before the survey was undertaken, but it was found that there were too many samples. I think we used in the sampling design, we used species number and abundance. And I think for some areas, maybe the crests, there were 40 samples should be taken. So we scaled this down to 10 for each topographical location, so it was more manageable. We also undertook a 2-meter beam trawl at 3 of the locations at each topographical zone. 2 2-meter beam trawls was undertaken for epifauna and litter. The Hammond grab was undertaken for sediment, fauna and litter. So we had some specific questions when we wrote the report. These are specifically for Annex 1 sandbanks. I'll go through the specific questions and the results for sandbanks, and then I'll talk about Savellaria spinulosa reef. So the specific questions were in regards to sandbank movement, how are sediments distributed, how do infauna and epifauna communities vary, and how similar biological communities are inside and outside of delineated sandbank features. Now this last question relates to Haysborough, Hammond, Winterton and Innerdowsing, Racebank and North Ridge only. And the last question was which biotopes exist and how do they vary across the sites, features and individual features. So sandbank topographical zones, have they changed over time? Well, we looked at the multi-beam. This needs to be run across the same location to undertake this assessment. So we used previous year's data where we could. Some of this was missing from other some of the areas, but within North Norfolk sandbanks and Saturn Reef, we were able to undertake this assessment for both the CSA areas. So this will only provide information on movement for the specific section of the bank, and it may not be indicative of the movement of the entire sandbank. Innerdowsing, only the western portion of the bank had coincident multi-beam. But Haysborough, Hammond and Winterton, there was no areas that coincided with any previous data. So you can see from Indefatigable Bank, there does not appear to be much movement from that position, whereas Lehman Bank, there seems to be slight movement on the crest and flank area. If we go back to Innerdowsing, there does seem to be quite a bit of a difference between 2016 and 2011. So we go to the next question. How are sediment types distributed across the 3 sandbanks and topographical zones? To do this, we undertook UNIS level 3 and entropy analysis on the particle size distribution data. So why did we use 2 methods? Well, UNIS gives you some broader categories: coarse sediments, mixed sediments, muddy and sandy mud, and sand. But we know that these sandbanks are primarily composed of sand, and we wanted to understand whether the fauna were characteristic of specific sand descriptors. So entropy was undertaken using entropy max, which is a non-hierarchical clustering method that summarizes PSD datasets into a finite number of groups. In this case, we selected 5 groups. And you can see, I don't know if you can see very clearly, that they contained, well, they were characterized by different fractions of the sand fraction. So if you see sediment group 1 was characterized more by medium sand, group 2 was coarse and medium sand, group 3 was characteristic more of a mixed sediment, 4 was finer sand, and 5 was medium to fine sand. So what did we find? We did find differences in sand composition, entropy, between the shoreward and seaward flanks, and between flanks and crests. For Southwest Haber Tail and Inner Dowsing, the crests and flanks were comprised of coarse sediments, with Inner Dowsing flanks also comprising mixed sediments associated with the presence of Sabellaria spinulosa. The troughs of all areas generally comprised greater gravel content, with some also comprising muds and mixed sediment. So the beyond sandbank zones at Inner Dowsing and Smith's Knoll generally reflected the same sediment composition to the troughs. Similar patterns in sediment composition were apparent between each of the SACs, between the wider characterising transects and the case study areas. So how do infauna and epifauna communities vary? We found that both infauna and epifauna on the crests were less speciose than on the flanks and the troughs, especially when associated with mixed sediments. The lowest overall numbers of species, crest, flank and trough, were observed at Southwest Haber Tail. This is an area of high hydrodynamic movement. Differences in species composition reflected the differences in sediment composition according to entropy. So we did see that on some flanks there were finer sediments, and the fauna reflected this in the sediment composition. On the right, you can see some of the species that we found and were characteristic of those topographical zones. So the sandbanks closer to shore showed a certain degree of distinction. These were characterised by species normally associated with intertidal or littoral habitats. There was a degree of variability in epifaunal communities inhabiting the different topographical zones, both within and between SACs, with more mobile species being ubiquitous and less mobile species restricted to the flanks and troughs. There were no differences in community structure between trough and beyond sandbank areas, just as we saw for the sediment composition. So how do infauna and epifauna communities vary in terms of function? For this, we selected secondary productivity, as it provides an indicator of the transfer of energy to the next trophic level. If we put this into context, when I've been talking through the results, in the North Sea, it's been estimated that between 1.66 and 968 kilojoules per metre squared per year is produced by various areas in the North Sea. So if we look at this area, we used production biomass ratio and total production. They were derived from the raw infaunal abundance and biomass data using the conversion factor and the equation to the right. The additional information was used in the model, such as station depths, mean annual bottom temperature, whether they were infauna or epifauna, motile, sedentary, and which taxonomic group they belonged to. So the total production at all topographical zones was generally below 100 kilojoules per metre squared per year, with lowest values on the crest. Now these were around 10 kilojoules, whilst the troughs were around 80 to 100. Differences, therefore, were observed between the topographical zones. Total production at Smith's Knoll, seaward flank, was 232 kilojoules per metre squared. This was twice as much as the normal troughs of other areas. This was the mollusk, Fabula fabula and Abra alba, contributed most to these values. Another high area was Inner Dowsing. This was the only CSA where the secondary production values exceeded 100 kilojoules per metre squared per year on more than one topographical zone. This was both the flanks, both sides of the sandbanks and the troughs, and exceeded 400 kilojoules per metre squared per year. This was presumably because of the presence of Sabellaria reef on those areas. Taxa contributing most to secondary production was largely governed by annelid worms. Echinoderms and crustaceans also contributed to this. So which biotopes exist and how do they vary across the sites? There were 9 biotopes identified at UNIS level 5 across the SACs, with a further 10 biotopes assigned to UNIS level 3 to 4, which is more or less a sediment category. The most widespread biotope of all was A5.321. This was infilittoral mobile clean sand with sparse fauna, and it was mainly associated to crests and flanks, but in some cases troughs in Haysborough Hammond and Inner Dowsing. So on the right here we've got North Norfolk Sandbanks and Saturn Reef, and then Inner Dowsing and Haysborough Hammond. Some biotopes were assigned were only found in specific SACs, such as the more offshore areas, such as A5.233, Nephthys cirrhosa and Bathymetry, and Echinocyanus pusillus, Ophelia borealis, and Abra prismatica in circulittoral fine sands, and A5.252, Abra prismatica, Bathymetry, and polychaetes in circulittoral fine sand. These were only assigned to the offshore area, offshore SAC. Circulittoral biotopes were generally assigned only to sandbanks in North Norfolk Sandbanks and Saturn Reef and Haysborough and Winterton, with the exception of Sabellaria spinulosa, which was assigned at Inner Dowsing on the flanks and the troughs. So now we go on to the survey design for Annex 1 Sabellaria spinulosa reef. A number of criteria were used to identify each area for targeting. So we have core reef areas, whether the areas overlap with proposed or existing fisheries management areas, whether previous data had been collected within the area, and how easy it was to access the sampling site for vessels. All sites have historical Sabellaria spinulosa data. All 3 areas selected in North Norfolk Sandbanks and Saturn Reef are proposed fisheries closure areas. In Haysborough and Winterton Northern Closure and Haysborough and Winterton Southern Closure within Haysborough and Winterton SAC, they incorporate marine management organisation, marine conservation bylaw areas which are closed to fishing. Docking Shoal and Lynn Knock in Inner Dowsing, Racebank, North Ridge incorporate marine management organisation fishery closure areas. Silver Pit and east of Silver Pit in Inner Dowsing incorporate proposed fishery closure areas. So the survey design for Annex 1 Sabellaria spinulosa reef, we undertook side-scan sonar using an EdgeTech 420 multipass tow fish at 0.3 metre resolution within each area. Seabed imagery was collected using a sea spider telemetry drop camera system. The number of transects varied within each area depending on what was found. Where Sabellaria spinulosa reef was observed, the percentage cover and an estimate of tube elevation were recorded for each 5 metre video segment, and a reefiness category was assigned. This was post-survey. So this was based on a Sabellaria spinulosa reef matrix based on Gubby. So in addition to Annex 1 sandbanks, we had specific questions for subalaria spinulosa reef. What is the current distribution? Has Annex 1 reef persisted in areas where it had previously been identified? Is Annex 1 reef present in the areas of modelled reef from the East Coast Regional Environmental Characterisation Acoustic Survey? Has Annex 1 reef persisted in the MMO bylaw closure areas? And how does the quality of reef vary across the 3 sites? And how does the epifaunal community composition and abundance of conspicuous fauna differ between Annex 1 reef and non-reef areas? So I'm going to cover the first 4 questions in the next slide, and then I'll cover the other questions. So the extent and distribution of Annex 1 subalaria spinulosa reef. So if we look at North Norfolk sandbanks, there was no evidence of subalaria spinulosa or suitable substrate for colonisation within north of Well Bank. That is the most southerly area that we see on the map on the right. There were presence of substrates suitable for subalaria spinulosa colonisation at north of Swart Bank, but no reefs were found. The eastern side of Lehman Bank, which isn't shown here, but it was observed in the GRAV survey that there were reefs present in the trough area, and the Lehman Bank is the most southerly sandbank found, and it was in this area here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm showing you on the mouse. So in this area, there was confirmed presence of low reefiness in the northern part of the survey area. The side-scan sonar signatures observed at Saturn Reef resembled a mottled cauliflower appearance usually associated with reef, but was confirmed as consolidated sediment with small patches of subalaria spinulosa in 3 of the 15 video transects. So we did go over an area which was previously surveyed in 2013. This was an area that had quite a high amount of subalaria. It was low to medium reef, but when we went over it, and we didn't find as much as had been found in previous years. This could be due to the difference in orientation of the transects, or it may be just that the subalaria reef has moved on. So Haysborough and Winterton, acoustic data showed that the area was complex with mottled areas. Areas of medium and high reef corresponded with the MMO bylaw area, Haysborough Tail, and the 2009 East Coast REC survey. It was the 2009 report, not the survey. The Gap Reef area within Haysborough and Winterton Southern Closure was classified with areas of medium to high reefiness. Low to medium and some high reef were identified outside the bylaw area, where it was previously observed during the East Coast REC survey. Areas of high and medium reef within Middle Cross Sound was associated with raised features observed from acoustic data, but similar acoustic signatures also seen in the area were actually classified as low reefiness or no reef. So for Inner Dowsing, Racebank and North Ridge, acoustic signatures were no different for areas containing reef or those without reef. Highest reefiness areas were located in the southeast of Docking Shoal area, outside of the area to be managed as reef, while low reef was observed inside this area to be managed as reef. East of Silver Pit contained areas of low to high reefiness, which coincided with the area to be managed as reef. Reef areas and surrounding coarse sediment exhibited similar signatures in the acoustic data. No evidence of Sabellaria spinulosa or suitable substrate was observed from acoustic or video at Lynn Knock. Low to high reef was observed at south of Silver Pit, where it had been previously observed. High reefiness coincided with several raised seabed features seen in the acoustic data, but low to medium reef signature was similar to the surrounding coarse sediments. So what is the reef quality in epifaunal communities? So I did a calculation of the percentage cover of each of the reef features that were assessed according to every five meters. And as you can see from this this table, it was Haysborough southern closure, which showed the greatest proportion of high reef and also medium reef. West of Middle Cross Sands contained a high proportion of low to medium reef with a smaller amount of high reef, and Haysborough Ham and Winterton northern closure contained mostly medium reef, but with a small proportion of high reef. This was the area with the best reef. And I've got some pictures below. So left to right, we've got Saturn Reef, east of Silver Pit, showing the different reef types. Haysborough Hammond and Winterton southern closure is your third picture from the left. And the two on the right were taken from west of Middle Cross Sand. So epifaunal communities. The analysis of epifaunal communities undertaken on video data from reef and non-reef areas. We found that similar community composition between reef areas and the coarse and mixed sediment. Common starfish, Asterias rubens, was absent from reef areas. This was in North Norfolk Sandbanks. Fauna characterising both reef and non-reef areas and all SACs include bryozoan, flustra, hydroids, dead man fingers, hermit crabs, and edible crab. At Haysborough Ham and Winterton, Asterias rubens was the most characteristic species and was more abundant where reef was present, especially at west of Middle Cross Sand. So the top right picture comes from west of Middle Cross Sand, where you can see a highly abundant Asterias rubens present. Large anthozoans, Caridian shrimps, and lobster Homerus gammarus were absent from non-reef areas in the Dowsing, West Bank, and North Ridge. Asterias rubens was present in areas in the Dowsing, but in lower abundance than the other SACs. So additional questions that were addressed by this survey were the MSFD descriptors 2 and 10, non-Indigenous species, and marine litter. So we did find non-Indigenous species. We found Crepidula, Faunacata, Maya arenaria, and Goniadella gracilis. On the figure on the left shows in green, you've got Crepidula, purple is Maya, and the very small pink point at the top of North Norfolk Sandbanks and Saturn Reef is Goniadella. On the right, we have the presence of litter. So in blue, we have plastic greater than 5 millimeters in length, and the light pink, you may not be able to see this because it's quite a small picture, plastic less than 5 millimeters. Anthropogenic material was also observed in a few of the videos. So what are the recommendations coming out of this report? So for Annex 1 sandbanks, we recommend the use of satellite-derived bathymetry which would cover a longer extent of the banks, although this would be limited to 15 to 20 meters depth. And this could be used to monitor the movement of the banks. We recommend acquisition of additional environmental parameters such as seabed slope angle and mean depth to help better understand potential drivers of spatial variability observed in fauna and epifauna. And before the next survey, we would recommend a post-hoc para-analysis following a thorough literature review of suitable metrics to indicate anthropogenic change. We also recommend to continue to monitor the topographical zones, including the beyond sandbank zones within each SAC, but take into consideration sandbank movement, i.e. no fixed stations. We also recommend non-statistical approaches to monitoring, such as changes in species or functional compositions using traits analysis. And we also recommend incorporation of fish stomach content analysis, which were collected for this 2016 survey, but there was no sufficient funding to process them. And we also recommend assessing the life history, stages of the fish, and the reproductive state of the fish to further understanding the functional role of the sandbanks. So for the sabularia, Annex 1 sabularia spinulosa reef, we recommend monitoring using a 200% coverage of side-scan sonar, allows multiple passes of any seabed features. This will result in improved ability to detect textural changes, differences, and elevation. We also recommend revisiting the 2016 survey areas to assess change and ensure that camera transects positioned on the acquired side-scan sonar interpretation. We recommend inclusion of rugosity measurements to aid reef height measurements. We also recommend the incorporation of novel approaches and gear types such as sonar camera for use, which is used in low visibility environments, and consider deploying during periods of minimum tidal flows. We recommend faunal data to be assessed for every 5-meter camera segment, plus taking additional still images to enable assessment of fauna associated with the different reefiness categories. We also recommend consideration of contemporary human activities such as fishing pressure that are likely to affect the ability of the reefs to re-establish. So that was my last slide. Thanks to all that were involved on the survey, for doing the report writing and review, and thanks for listening. Over to the next person.
Brilliant, thank you, Jackie. I've just had a note through just clarifying that the offshore fisheries management measures referred to in Jackie's talk are those which were proposed at the time of the survey in 2016. But without further ado, I'll pass on to Paula.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Yes, I'm ready to go. I'm just going to share my screen now. So hopefully you can see that okay?
Yeah, that's all good.
Brilliant, thank you for confirming. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paula Lightfoot. I'm an Earth Observation Specialist at JNCC, and I'm going to talk about some recent work we've been doing to look into whether satellite data could help us to monitor these sandbanks in these SACs. So as we heard from Jackie's talk, acoustic surveys like side-scan sonar can generate really high quality data, but unfortunately they are expensive to carry out. It would be very challenging to cover the whole area of these 3 MPAs. And because of this, the authors of the survey report from the survey we've just been hearing about suggested that open access satellite data could possibly be used to detect the sandbank crests and monitor their movement. So that recommendation led to a chat between the Marine Monitoring and Evidence team here at JNCC and the Earth Observation Specialists in the Ecosystems Analysis team. As a result of that, we agreed that we'd do a quick investigation, that was last winter, just to see whether deriving bathymetry from satellite data was something worth considering for these North Sea SACs. So just to explain, satellite-derived bathymetry isn't a new concept. There's several well-known methods which have been tried and tested in both marine and freshwater environments all around the world, although they do tend to have greater success in the clearer tropical waters, which the North Sea is not. You can get bathymetry from optical satellite imagery, which is capturing sunlight reflected off the Earth's surface, because as I'm sure you know, light is attenuated in water and different colours are attenuated at different rates. So satellite-derived bathymetry works on the principle of there being a linear relationship between depth and the reflectance value of one band or multiple bands, or between depth and the ratio of one band to another. So these kind of empirical methods are easy to understand and apply, but they do need ground truth data, it's like acoustic survey data, to establish what that linear relationship is. As an alternative, there are physics-based models which don't need ground truth data. These kind of create a model satellite image based on things like the seabed type, backscattering, the chlorophyll A content in the water, the turbidity, and then invert that to predict depth from given pixel values, which sounds more complicated. It is a lot more complicated. It does have the benefit of not needing ground truth data, and this kind of approach is widely used by commercial firms. You can also get bathymetry from satellite radar data, and this has the advantage over optical data that is not affected by cloud. You can get data day and night and it can see through the cloud. Radar pulses bounce back off the Earth's surface or the sea's surface, and that gives us insight into how rough or smooth that surface is. And then you can get bathymetry values from the pattern of waves on the sea surface, because in shallower water, wavelengths, distance between the waves, are shorter than they are in deeper water, so you can work that out. Anyway, I'm going to tell you about the approach that we took to calculate bathymetry from satellite data, and this is called the log transform band ratio method. As I mentioned, light attenuation in water is wavelength dependent, so both green and blue penetrate quite far, but green light is attenuated more rapidly than blue, so it's got lower reflectance values, and that difference between green and blue increases with depth. So if you've got ground truth depth measurements, such as the acoustic survey data that we got in 2016, you can find out what the linear relationship is between depth and this green-blue ratio. And then when you know that, you can use this formula to predict depth in the areas of the image where you don't have the survey data. So you can kind of extrapolate out. So you get your log blue and log green values for the formula from your satellite imagery itself, and then the M1 and M0 values are the slope and the y-intercept from that linear relationship between depth and the green-blue ratio. So let's have a look at our study area again. Sentinel-2 imagery comes supplied as 100 kilometre by 100 kilometre square tiles, and our 3 SACs are covered by 4 of these tiles and 2 different orbits. So there's one of them, but one of the orbits doesn't quite fully cover all 3 of the MPAs. But what this does mean is that there's new satellite imagery being captured over the site every few days. Of course, not all the imagery is stuff that we can use. On many days, you'll find it's covered by cloud, or especially that the water's too turbid and you can't see right through to the seabed. So I went through all the imagery back to 2015, which is when the first Sentinel-2 satellite was launched. And I found there was about 1 to 4 images per year that's actually usable and looks like this really nice, clear imagery that I'm showing you on the screen. But the question is, with these really nice images, can we detect sandbanks? So I did a quick test using the area shown here, just this corner of the Inner Dowsing, Racebank and North Ridge SAC. So here's an image of that part of the SAC, and this is created by dividing the log of the green band by the log of the blue band. And this imagery just happened to be collected in August 2019. And areas where the difference between green and blue is small are shown in red, and so these correspond to shallower water. Now we can see there's a few issues with the imagery. There's a bit of cloud, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but a bit of cloud up here, but that could be masked out. All these little dots in the images are wind turbines, so that's fine, we know what they are, but they would hinder automated analysis of the data. And then the diagonal stripe that you can probably see going down the image is an artifact that's caused by the way the data is collected, basically. But despite this, the good news is you can very clearly see the crest of a sandbank here. So this is the acoustic data from the 2016 survey that Jackie was talking about. So black is deeper and the light grey is shallower. So this actually corresponds really well to the crest of the sandbank picked out in the imagery. So that was a very positive start. But the next thing we had to do was see, can we accurately calculate depth from the imagery? So we did a preliminary study using this bit of acoustic data, which has got a depth range from 8 meters at the crest to 22 meters in the trough. Just to explain, before you use satellite data, it needs to be processed to correct for distortion caused by the Earth's atmosphere and the surface. And we used analysis-ready data that has been processed either in-house at JNCC or by DEFRA, and that's using a method which is really more optimized for terrestrial applications rather than marine applications, but we thought we'd give it a go. Then we extracted pixels from the Sentinel-2 imagery that overlapped the acoustic survey data and calculated the mean depth of each satellite data pixel. The Sentinel-2 imagery is 10-meter resolution, so in one single pixel, there are 100 pixels of acoustic survey data. Then we plot the mean of the log green over log blue values against 10 centimeter depth increments, so we aggregate the data a little bit, to find out what we call the extinction depth. And that's the depth at which light attenuation of both bands is so great that there's not really any longer any obvious relationship between the green-blue ratio. And so in this case, that's what the blue line indicates, that it all just gets a bit messy below 15 meters depth. So we removed data points below 15 meters and split the rest of the data into 2 subsets of equal size and used one for training, one for validation. Then we plot the log green over log blue values against depth using the training data, generate this linear trend line. And as I mentioned before, use the y-intercept and the slope values from the regression equation, along with those log green and blue values, to predict the depth for each pixel. And then finally, using the validation data set, calculate the accuracy from the difference between the actual measured depth and the depth that we've predicted. So which in this case, it was just over 2 meters of root mean square error and 1.6 meters mean absolute error, which is actually quite good considering the challenge of doing this in the turbid North Sea waters. So our quick preliminary study showed that the shallow sandbank crests can definitely be detected from Sentinel-2 imagery. We can calculate the depth to like plus or minus 2 meters accuracy, but this was quite limited because we only looked at one sandbank crest and one satellite image. So we offered this as a research project to students on Newcastle University's International Marine Environmental Consultancy MSc programme. And we're very happy that one of the students actually chose that for her project. So her aims are shown here. She aimed to increase the spatial and temporal range of the study. She looked at 8 sandbank crests with peaks ranging from 4 to 16 meters below the sea surface. And then she compared data pre-processed using our existing methods, which, as I said, were a bit optimized for terrestrial applications, with data processed by Plymouth Marine Laboratory, because they've got methods for atmospheric correction, which is optimized for marine applications. So we thought we'd see how they compare. She also aimed to compare 2 empirical methods, repeating our log transform band ratio method that I've described, but also looking at the multi-band method, which looks for relationships between depth and other bands in the imagery, not just green and blue. And then finally, she looked into ways of measuring turbidity using satellite data. So it was a very useful project. It produced some key findings, which will definitely help our ongoing investigations into whether this could help support MPA monitoring. She found that the log transform band ratio that we've been using definitely is the preferred choice because only 3 bands in the imagery actually showed any linear relationship at all with depth in our study area. And one of those bands was probably too low resolution to be useful for sandbank movement detection. She applied the log transform band ratio to 8 sandbanks, 5 of which had crests shallower than 15 meters and 3 had crests deeper than 15 meters. And for the shallower ones, she got mean accuracies of 1.1 meters when she removed data below the extinction depth, or 3 meters when she used all the data. So that's showing very good accuracy for above 15 meters. For the 3 deeper sandbanks, whose crests were between 16 to 18 meters deep, she got mean accuracy of about 6 meters, which is obviously not very good, but not at all unexpected. A more positive finding was that there wasn't really much difference between the results when using the data processed by us at JNCC or DEFRA or by PML, which is really good news because we're routinely producing this analysis-ready data on a daily or weekly basis. So it's good to know we can use it for this type of application. We don't need to invest and learn a whole new processing routine. And then finally, she found out that using an existing package for producing turbidity values, she could do that from Sentinel-2 imagery, and it seemed to work well. So with a bit further work, that could produce turbidity masks to help filtering the data. And all of the R scripts produced during this research are freely available on the JNCC GitHub repository of code for working with Sentinel satellite data. So what we can conclude from this research is that shallow sandbank crests definitely can be detected from Sentinel-2 imagery, processed using the methods that we already have available to us. Obviously, there's more work to be done, but it does seem likely that satellite-derived bathymetry could play a role in future monitoring programs alongside all the other techniques that you've heard described, because obviously it can only detect physical properties and only above 15 meters. Turbidity and cloud do limit data availability, but at the rates that sandbanks are thought to move, one image a year would actually be fine for us, and that would definitely be feasible. We could also investigate using very high resolution commercial imagery, which is collected more frequently, that give us a good chance of getting those cloud-free days. So yeah, just to finish up, satellite-based methods, they are just one tool in the box here, but with a bit further work, they could maybe be used to help prioritize and target those more expensive acoustic surveys to areas that seem to be changing. So I'll say thank you very much to everyone who's supported this research, and especially Gemma Hoyes, the MSc student who carried out some of that research, and her supervisors at Newcastle University. And we will be very happy to take any questions. And of course, that's not just questions for me, but any of the other speakers that we've heard today. So I'll hand back to you, Adam.
Thanks, Paula. So yeah, as Paula says, if you would like to ask any questions to any of our panelists, please feel free to do so now. Because we've got a few panelists today, if you wouldn't mind just specifying which panelist you're asking. And yeah, I'm just going to wait for a couple of questions to come in. Okay. So we've got a first question through. Jackie, I think this one's for you. Jackie's multi-beam analysis seemed to suggest sandbank movement of 1 to 2 meters depth between surveys, which is about the same as the satellite error value. Sorry, that's for Paula.
Yeah, well, what I understood at the start of this research from colleagues in JNCC and CFAS, that the sandbanks are thought to migrate along the seabed, and if I recall correctly, it could be from 10 meters per year. Yeah, they could move from about 10 meters in a year to, I believe, 100 meters a year, and maybe my colleagues might correct me if I've got that wrong. But it's not just about depth fluctuations, it's also about migration along the seabed, and that is something that we could detect from satellite imagery. But yes, the initial survey had a kind of vertical accuracy of errors of 2 meters. The second one, where we sort of refined the method and looked at more crests, was getting accuracy of about 1 meter in the elevation data, but only above 15 meters. But I think the important thing, rather than the absolute depth, is the relative depth, because if we can detect sort of where the crests are and where the troughs are and where they're moving, because the key question is, are those SAC boundaries still protecting all of that Annex 1 habitat, is there a risk that it might move outside and the boundaries would have to be adjusted? So, you know, I think there's potential to tell that from the satellite imagery, even if we can't be too confident about the exact absolute depth, you know, within a couple of meters error.
Brilliant, thank you, Paula. Yeah, I think that's answered that person's question. So our next question is a question for Jackie. Are there existing habitat suitability models for Sabellaria? Sorry. Would habitat suitability models be useful for managing these sites?
Yes, I think they probably would, because I know there is an existing program at JNCC looking at habitat suitability models for Sabellaria. So yes, because you can use the sediment to predict where you might get Sabellaria colonizing.
Perfect, thank you, Jackie. We just had an initial flurry of questions through, and oh, I got another one. So we've got another question for you, Jackie. How often do you plan on revisiting the 2016 survey areas to assess change of the sandbanks and Sabellaria reefs?
I think I need to pass that over to Louisa and Mike, if that's okay. I'm not in charge of that.
Sure. Louisa, Mike?
Still here?
Yeah, we're here. I'm not sure if Fanula's on the line then, but I think the plan is every 6 years, but I'm estimating that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
If I can just chip in from the natural eminence side, it is definitely resource dependent. Ideally, we'd like to visit every 3rd year for some aspects of the site, but it really is unlikely in the current scenario.
Brilliant.
Adam, it's Fanula here, if I can pick up on that. At JNCC, we have quite a number of offshore sites, and in Secretary of State waters, we have, in English offshore, we have 27 offshore MPAs. So we're going through a process to figure out which subset of MPAs we'll focus on for monitoring. So it looks like we'll monitor a reduced set of the MPAs. So we haven't yet decided which ones are in the list.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We've got another question come through for Jackie. Have any management measures for Sabellaria been revised or altered based on the findings, e.g. where you didn't find Sabellaria in management areas or vice versa?
I don't believe they have, but Louisa and Mike can come in. We still keep the boundary because they are potential habitats for Sabellaria spinulosa colonization, and if anthropogenic, well, we still don't know whether the absence is caused by anthropogenic or natural causes. So we need to keep the boundaries the same. I'm presuming Mike and Louisa and Fanula might come in on that one too.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I think exactly like you say, now that we have the results and findings from the monitoring report, we'll be using those to update the conservation packages for all 3 sites, and they will be fed into the management measures for the sites. So there are no sort of new management measures that have been put in place since the 2013 survey, but yeah, it's sort of still in the process at the moment for the offshore.
Thanks, Louisa. We are currently out of questions, so just a quick reminder, if you wouldn't mind asking questions now if you have some, or I'm sure the panelists would be able to reply by email if you want to ask it outside of this session. But why not take the opportunity now? So we have another question. Is any monitoring undertaken around wind turbines to assess their impact of the biological and physical characteristics of the sandbanks?
Would that be a question for me?
Doesn't really say.
I think, well, that depends on the license conditions of the offshore wind farm itself. If we're talking about Race Bank, I'm not sure of their licensing license conditions for monitoring. I think they would have had to have undertaken some type of monitoring, benthic monitoring.
Yes, that's right.
For my head, I can't think.
Yeah, that's right. The offshore wind farms should be doing that monitoring of impacts in compliance with license conditions. So we'd get that information from them.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. I hope that's answered your question. And we've got no further questions now. So just waiting for if there's any latecomers. Do any of the panelists have anything to add?
Not from me, thanks, Adam.
Okay.
No, nothing from me. Happy to answer any questions by email.
Perfect. Thank you. I assume you're all happy with that. If any questions come through late or that would rather be asked via email.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to add thank you for the opportunity to take part, and yeah, I'd be happy to have any questions about any of the Earth observation side of things or any other applications for Earth observation. You can contact our team.
Perfect. Thank you, Paula. Okay, well, I'm not getting any further questions through now, so just take this opportunity to say thank you to all our panelists for today. It's been a really enjoyable talk today. I hope you've come away with something. And thank you to everyone who's attended and asked questions. So I will close the webinar. Have a lovely day.